For 40 years, the mansion at the end of Briarwood Road has stood completely silent. The property sits behind a tall iron gate that is now rusted and nearly shut, its metal bars stained dark from decades of rain and weather. Beyond the gate, a narrow driveway curves slowly through a line of overgrown trees before revealing the house itself. A massive structure of brick and stone that once looked elegant, almost regal, when it was first built. Today it looks different. The windows are dark, many of them covered by layers of dust and grime that dull the glass. Roof tiles have shifted slightly out of place over time, and vines have slowly climbed their way up the outer walls as if nature has been patiently reclaiming the structure piece by piece. Yet despite all of that, the mansion itself still stands strong. The foundation is solid. The walls remain heavy and unmoved by time. It hasn't collapsed or fallen apart the way many abandoned homes eventually do. Instead, it sits there quietly, watching the world around it change year after year. Most abandoned houses do not survive very long once people leave them behind. Windows break. Animals move in. Roofs begin to leak and wood slowly rots away. Within a decade, most buildings begin to show serious signs of decay. But the Briarwood Mansion somehow survived. The structure endured storms, winters, and long summers without care. And what makes that even stranger is that no one has lived there since 1984. The mansion was originally built in 1926 by a wealthy businessman named Robert Halstead. At the time, Briarwood Road was one of the most desirable places to live in the region. Wealthy families built large estates there, surrounded by trees and gardens that offered privacy from the growing towns nearby. Halstead had made his fortune in steel manufacturing during the early industrial expansion, and like many men of his success, he decided to build a home that reflected the scale of his achievements. The result was enormous. The mansion stretched across 3 floors and contained more than 15 bedrooms. There were wide dining halls designed for large gatherings, a formal library lined with dark wooden shelves, and a ballroom on the 2nd floor where guests could gather for music and dancing. Outside, the property included landscaped gardens, long walking paths, and a lawn large enough to host summer parties. Local newspapers at the time described the mansion as one of the grandest private residences in the entire county. Photographs from the 1930s show elegant gatherings held on the property. Guests dressed in formal clothing stood on the wide front steps, while cars lined the driveway beyond the iron gate. Music drifted through the tall windows during evening events, and the mansion glowed brightly at night, with every room lit from within. For decades, the Halstead family maintained that lifestyle. The house was alive with activity. Servants moved quietly through the hallways. Deliveries arrived regularly at the back entrance. The gardens were trimmed and shaped with careful attention. To anyone who passed by, the mansion represented wealth, stability, and success. But sometime in the late 1970s, things inside the house began to change. At first, the changes were subtle enough that only neighbors noticed them. The large parties that once filled the lawn every summer slowly stopped happening. The lights that used to glow through nearly every window at night became fewer. Visitors who once arrived frequently were no longer seen coming through the gate. The property that had once been perfectly maintained began to lose its shape. The bushes grew uneven. The grass in the front yard began to grow taller between cuts. The long driveway no longer showed tire tracks every day. Something inside the Halstead household had clearly changed, but the family never spoke about it publicly. Robert Halstead himself had died several years earlier, leaving the mansion to his only son, Daniel Halstead. Daniel moved into the house with his wife and their young daughter shortly after his father's death. For several years, their lives appeared completely ordinary. The family was occasionally seen walking through the neighborhood. The daughter attended a nearby private school. Nothing about their lives suggested anything unusual. But sometime around 1982, the mansion grew noticeably quieter. Neighbors who once saw members of the family regularly began to notice that the house appeared dark most nights. Deliveries that once arrived weekly stopped appearing. Even the mailbox near the gate began to overflow with unopened letters. Then in the spring of 1984, the Halstead family left the mansion. Not slowly, not through a long moving process. They simply left. One neighbor later recalled seeing a single moving truck arrive early one morning. The truck remained there for only a few hours while a small amount of furniture was removed from the house. No large moving crew appeared. No extensive packing took place. Only a few items were loaded into the truck before it drove away again. That afternoon, the front gate was closed, and the mansion fell silent. That was the last time anyone reported seeing the Halstead family at the property. At first, people assumed the family had simply relocated. Wealthy families often moved for business opportunities or personal reasons, and large homes were sometimes left empty for years before being sold. But the Briarwood mansion was never listed for sale. The property was never advertised. No new owners appeared. Months passed, then years, and the Halstead family never returned. As time went on, the house began to develop a strange reputation in the neighborhood. Children growing up nearby heard stories about the mansion and dared each other to approach the iron gate after dark. Some believed the family had mysteriously disappeared. Others claimed something terrible must have happened inside the house shortly before they left. But no official report ever confirmed any of those rumors. As far as public records showed, the family had simply moved away and never come back. For 40 years, the mansion remained untouched. Trees grew taller along the driveway. Leaves collected in thick layers across the porch each autumn. Dust slowly settled inside rooms that once held expensive furniture and polished wooden floors. The world around Briarwood Road continued to change as new homes and businesses appeared nearby. But the Halstead mansion stayed exactly where it had always been, quiet and unmoving behind its rusted iron gate. Then, for decades later, someone finally stepped inside again. In 2024, a group of property investors purchased the abandoned estate with plans to evaluate the building's condition. They wanted to determine whether the mansion could be restored or if it would eventually need to be demolished. On a cool autumn morning, they arrived at the property for the first time. The iron gate creaked loudly as it was pushed open after years of rust and neglect. The long driveway was covered in fallen leaves that crunched beneath their shoes as they walked toward the house. From a distance, the mansion still looked impressive despite its age. The brick walls remained strong, and the tall windows reflected the pale sky above. But when they reached the front door, something strange became immediately clear. The door was still locked exactly as it had been left decades earlier. The brass handle was tarnished with age, but the wood itself remained solid and unbroken. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere around the doorframe or windows. That meant something important. In 40 years, no one had broken into the mansion. Carefully, one of the investors took the old key that had been included in the property documents and slid it into the lock. The metal turned with a loud click that echoed across the silent porch. Slowly, the heavy wooden door opened. Cool air drifted out from the dark interior. The foyer stretched ahead into shadow while thin beams of sunlight filtered through the tall windows and illuminated clouds of dust floating in the air. But what surprised them most was not the dust. It was what remained inside the house. Chairs still stood around the dining table. Books remained neatly placed along the shelves of the library. Paintings still hung on the walls exactly where they had been left decades earlier. It didn't look like a house that had been emptied or abandoned. It looked like a house where someone had simply stepped outside and forgotten to return. The group walked deeper inside, their footsteps echoing across the marble floor of the foyer. The silence felt strange, not the hollow emptiness of a ruined building, but the quiet stillness of a place where life had stopped suddenly. Then, as they reached the base of the main staircase and looked up toward the second floor, one of them noticed something that made everyone stop moving. At the top of the stairs, a faint yellow glow was shining from the hallway above. A light was on, and if the mansion had truly been abandoned for 40 years, there should have been no reason for any light inside the house to be glowing at all. For several seconds after noticing the faint yellow glow upstairs, no one moved. The group remained standing at the base of the staircase, their eyes fixed on the second-floor hallway where the light was shining. The mansion had already felt strange when they first stepped inside, but this changed everything. If the house had truly been abandoned for 40 years, there should not have been electricity running through the building at all. Old homes that sit empty that long usually have their power disconnected long before decades pass. And even if electricity had somehow remained active, a single light bulb surviving and glowing after 40 years seemed almost impossible. Yet there it was, glowing softly in the hallway above them. One of the investors suggested that it might simply be sunlight reflecting off something in the hallway. The explanation sounded reasonable enough to break the tension, so the group slowly began climbing the staircase to take a closer look. The wooden steps creaked quietly beneath their weight as they moved upward. The staircase curved gently toward the second floor, and the farther they climbed, the more the glow from the hallway became visible. Dust covered the railings and edges of the stairs, but the center of each step looked slightly clearer, as if something had disturbed the dust at some point long after the house had been abandoned. None of them mentioned it out loud, but everyone noticed it. When they finally reached the top of the stairs, the source of the light became unmistakable. It was not sunlight at all. A chandelier-style ceiling fixture hung in the center of the hallway, fitted with several small yellow bulbs. One of those bulbs was glowing faintly, casting a warm light across the corridor. The hallway itself stretched long and narrow across the second floor, with bedroom doors lining both sides. The air up there felt colder than downstairs, and the faint humming sound of electricity could be heard from the light above. One of the investors stepped toward the nearest wall switch and flipped it down. Nothing happened. The bulb continued glowing exactly as before. He flipped the switch again, then tried the one beside it. Still nothing. The light remained on. That meant the switch was no longer controlling the fixture. Either the wiring had been altered at some point or the light had been turned on manually and left that way. The group exchanged uncertain glances. If someone had turned it on manually, that meant someone had been inside the house at some point after the family disappeared in 1984. The hallway itself showed the same frozen stillness as the rest of the mansion. A thick layer of dust coated the wooden floorboards, except for faint streaks where air had moved through small gaps in the windows over the years. The walls were decorated with framed photographs and paintings that had faded slightly with age. Some of the frames hung crookedly, but nothing had been knocked over or vandalized. It looked like a place that had simply been forgotten rather than destroyed. They approached the first bedroom door on the left and pushed it open. The hinges groaned softly as the door swung inward. Inside was a large bedroom that had clearly belonged to someone important in the house. A heavy wooden bed frame stood against the far wall, the mattress sagging slightly from decades without use. The curtains near the window had faded to a pale color and hung loosely from rusted rods. A dresser stood against the opposite wall, its mirror clouded with dust. The entire room was covered in a gray film that suggested no one had entered it for many years. They checked the next bedroom, then another. Each one looked almost identical. Furniture remained exactly where it had been placed decades earlier. Bedspreads had collected dust until their original color was barely visible. Closets contained old clothing hanging quietly on wooden hangers. The rooms felt less like abandoned spaces and more like paused moments in time. Eventually, the group reached the final door at the end of the hallway. Unlike the others, this door was completely closed. One of the investors noticed something strange immediately. The wood surface of the door appeared slightly cleaner than the others. Not spotless, but noticeably less dusty. He ran his hand across it and examined the faint residue on his fingers. There was dust there, but far less than what covered the other doors in the hallway. Another person pointed toward the floor. The dust on the floorboards in front of the door had been disturbed. Faint footprints were visible, partially faded but still recognizable. The sight made the group uneasy. Those footprints were not recent, but they were clearly newer than the thick, untouched dust covering most of the hallway. Someone had walked there at some point after the mansion was abandoned. One of the investors slowly turned the handle. The metal clicked softly as the latch released. The door creaked open, revealing a study. The room looked larger than the others they had explored. Bookshelves lined two of the walls, filled with rows of old leather-bound books. A heavy wooden desk sat near the window, positioned so that someone working there would have a clear view of the front lawn. Beside the desk was a large reading chair with worn fabric and carved wooden arms. But what caught their attention immediately was the desk itself. Sitting near the center of the desk was a glass of water. The glass was clear and unbroken, and inside it the water still sat halfway to the top. The surface of the water reflected the faint glow of the hallway light behind them. Everyone stopped moving. Water does not stay like that for decades. Even in sealed containers, water slowly evaporates over time. A glass left untouched for 40 years should have been completely dry. Yet this one wasn't. One of the investors stepped closer to examine it. The glass felt cool to the touch. The water inside looked perfectly clear, without dust or debris floating in it. That meant something almost impossible. Someone had placed that glass there recently. The group began looking around the study more carefully. The dust covering the bookshelves was uneven, as if a few books had been removed and replaced not long ago. The reading chair beside the desk was pushed back slightly, like someone had stood up from it. Even the floor beneath the desk showed faint marks where someone's shoes had shifted recently. Then one of them noticed something on the wall above the desk. A framed photograph hung there. The picture showed the Halstead family standing together on the front lawn of the mansion many years earlier. Robert Halstead stood proudly beside his son Daniel, while Daniel's wife held their young daughter's hand. The photograph had clearly been taken sometime in the early 1980s, just a few years before the house was abandoned. But something about the frame was wrong. There was no dust on it. The glass covering the photograph was completely clean. Every other frame in the hallway had been coated in decades of dust, but this one looked as if someone had wiped it recently. The realization spread quietly through the room. The glass of water, the disturbed books, the footprints in the hallway, the clean photograph, and the light that was still glowing upstairs. All of it pointed toward the same conclusion. This house had not been completely empty. One of the investors slowly turned toward the others and spoke in a quiet voice that echoed through the silent study. "This place isn't abandoned." No one disagreed. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees surrounding the property. The long driveway beyond the iron gate remained empty, with no cars or people anywhere in sight. But inside the mansion, something felt different now. The silence was no longer the silence of an empty house. It felt like the quiet of a place where someone was listening. Somewhere within the massive structure of the Halstead mansion, beyond the dusty hallways and forgotten rooms, the feeling lingered that someone else might still be there.